When one of Hollywood's most respected and intellectually admired actresses steps onto the set of a live daytime talk show, audiences expect insight, charm, and perhaps a thoughtful discussion about art and culture. What they rarely anticipate is a collision of perspectives so sharp that it transforms a routine promotional appearance into a moment that feels larger than the show itself. That was the atmosphere in the studio the day Natalie Portman arrived on the set of The View. What was intended to be a calm, engaging conversation about her latest directorial project gradually evolved into a tense and emotionally charged exchange that left both the audience and viewers at home stunned. Natalie Portman had come to discuss a deeply personal and ambitious project, a film she directed that explores the lives of women living under authoritarian regimes and the quiet, everyday courage it takes to defend fundamental human rights in environments designed to suppress them. The project was not merely entertainment. It was a carefully researched and passionately crafted story that aimed to shed light on the resilience of women whose voices are often silenced. As an actress known for balancing blockbuster success with serious dramatic work, Portman had earned a reputation for choosing projects that carried emotional and intellectual weight. Her transition into directing such a subject felt like a natural evolution of her career. When she walked onto the set, the initial energy was warm and welcoming. The other hosts greeted her with admiration, asking thoughtful questions about her creative process, the challenges of directing, and the inspiration behind the film's powerful message. Portman spoke eloquently about collaboration, about the responsibility she felt toward accurately representing the lived experiences of women in restrictive societies, and about the universal importance of dignity and equality. The audience nodded, along clearly engaged by her sincerity and calm confidence. However, the tone began to shift when Joy Behar entered the conversation with a noticeably sharper edge. With a subtle smirk that cameras did not miss, she remarked that the film seemed quite political. Her comment carried an undertone suggesting that Portman might be using her platform not merely to tell a story, but to advocate for a specific ideological stance. It was a pivot from artistic discussion to political interrogation. Portman adjusted slightly in her chair but maintained her composed demeanor. She responded carefully, emphasizing that stories about human rights are not inherently political, they are human. She explained that focusing on dignity, freedom, and equality transcends partisan lines. For her, the film was about amplifying voices that deserve to be heard, not about promoting a partisan agenda. Her tone was measured, thoughtful, and steady, but Behar pressed further, leaning forward, her voice carrying a more confrontational energy. She questioned whether celebrities should stay in their lane rather than stepping into political discourse. The implication was clear. Entertainers, no matter how informed or passionate, should avoid influencing public conversation on controversial issues. It was a familiar debate, whether public figures have a responsibility to remain neutral or whether their platforms naturally invite broader engagement. The atmosphere in the studio grew palpably tense. The other hosts exchanged quick, uneasy glances. They recognized the shift from discussion to confrontation. Whoopi Goldberg attempted to steer the conversation back toward the artistic aspects of the film, clearing her throat and interjecting with a lighter question. But the tension lingered like static in the air. Behar wasn't finished. She questioned Portman's qualifications to tackle such a heavy subject, asking what gave her the authority to create a film about authoritarianism. It was a pointed challenge, implying that experience, background, or perhaps political alignment might determine who is allowed to tell certain stories. Portman's response was grounded in conviction. She spoke about research, collaboration with experts, conversations with activists and survivors, and the universal responsibility artists have to explore meaningful themes. She emphasized that storytelling has always been a vehicle for confronting injustice. From ancient theater to modern cinema, art has reflected society's struggles and aspirations. To her, engaging with difficult topics was not overstepping. It was fulfilling the very purpose of creative expression. As the exchange unfolded, the audience could sense that this was no longer a routine promotional segment. It had become a broader debate about celebrity influence, artistic freedom, and the intersection of culture and politics. Viewers at home likely found themselves choosing sides, reflecting on whether artists should confine themselves to entertainment or whether their visibility grants them a unique opportunity, and perhaps obligation, to speak on pressing issues. Throughout the confrontation, Portman remained composed, never raising her voice. Her calmness contrasted sharply with the escalating tone of the questioning. That contrast amplified the drama of the moment. The tension was not explosive in volume, but in intensity. It was the kind of exchange that leaves a studio audience holding its breath, uncertain of what might come next. By the end of the segment, the energy in the room felt fundamentally altered. What began as a simple promotional appearance had transformed into a moment that sparked conversation far beyond the studio walls. Clips circulated online, discussions ignited across social media, and viewers debated the role of artists in public discourse. In many ways, the confrontation underscored a larger cultural question. Who gets to tell stories about power, oppression, and justice? And should the platform of fame be used solely for entertainment? Or can it serve as a catalyst for awareness and change? Natalie Portman's appearance illustrated how quickly a conversation about art can evolve into a reflection of society's deepest divisions. What was meant to be an ordinary interview became a defining television moment, one that highlighted the delicate balance between free expression, public responsibility, and the evolving expectations placed on public figures in an increasingly polarized world. The atmosphere in the studio, already strained from the earlier exchange, seemed to tighten even further as the conversation continued. Joy leaned back in her chair for only a moment before launching into another pointed remark. Her tone sharpened with unmistakable skepticism. She suggested that Natalie had spent her entire adult life in Hollywood, surrounded by people who shared her worldview, insulated from the perspectives of everyday Americans. The implication was clear, that Portman's experiences were limited, shaped by an echo chamber of like-minded elites detached from the realities of ordinary citizens. For a split second, the tension registered physically on Natalie's face. Her jaw tightened and her fingers interlocked more firmly in her lap. Yet when she spoke, her voice remained steady and controlled. She did not match the aggression with aggression. Instead, she chose to respond with facts. She reminded the panel that she had studied psychology at Harvard University, emphasizing that her education was not merely a footnote in her biography, but a rigorous academic pursuit. She explained that her time there was not about prestige or status, but about understanding human behavior, social systems, and the complexities of thought and emotion. She continued by noting that her perspective had been shaped not only by education, but by experience. She had traveled extensively, worked with human rights organizations, and engaged directly with communities facing oppression and systemic challenges. Her involvement was not superficial, she implied. It was rooted in years of research, conversations, and collaboration with experts and activists. Most importantly, she stated calmly, she believed that art has a responsibility to challenge audiences, to make them uncomfortable at times, to spark reflection, and to encourage deeper thinking about the world around them. Joy responded with visible impatience. Rolling her eyes dramatically, she dismissed the mention of Harvard as though it were a predictable talking point. The Harvard card again, she scoffed, suggesting that attending an elite university for a few years did not grant someone a superior understanding of the world. Her tone carried a biting edge, as though she were puncturing what she perceived as intellectual arrogance. The audience began to murmur audibly. This was no longer the lively but balanced debate viewers had come to expect. The energy felt different, less like a spirited exchange of ideas, and more like something personal, something edging toward hostility. There was a discomfort in the room that could not be disguised by polite smiles or commercial breaks. Sunny, Hostin attempted to ease the tension, gently interjecting that perhaps the focus should return to the film itself, its artistic merits, its storytelling, its performances. It was a clear effort to redirect the conversation toward safer ground, but Joy waved her off, insisting that the line of questioning was important. In her view, this was not just about a movie, it was about accountability and authenticity. Then came the remark that shifted the atmosphere yet again. Joy questioned whether it was hypocritical for someone who had earned millions of dollars playing dress-up to lecture working-class Americans about political choices. The phrasing was deliberate and dismissive, reducing decades of professional acting to a childlike activity. It framed Portman's career not as disciplined craft, but as trivial performance, disconnected from real-world struggles. The words hung in the air for a moment, heavy and sharp. Natalie's composure faltered, just slightly. There was a flicker of disbelief in her expression. "Excuse me?" she responded, the steadiness in her voice now tinged with restrained emotion. She clarified that she had been acting professionally since the age of 12, dedicating her life to a craft that demanded discipline, resilience, and intellectual engagement. Acting, she implied, was not mere costume and pretense. It was storytelling, empathy, research, and transformation. She might have gone on to explain how embodying different characters requires understanding diverse lives and perspectives, how portraying complex roles involves studying social contexts, histories, and psychological nuances. For her, acting was not an escape from reality, but often a deep dive into it. Through film, she had explored trauma, identity, war, love, and moral conflict, subjects that resonate far beyond the red carpet. The suggestion that her financial success invalidated her opinions seemed to strike a deeper chord. It raised the broader question of whether economic privilege automatically disqualifies someone from engaging in social or political discourse. Natalie's expression suggested that she found the premise not only unfair, but dismissive of the effort she had invested in understanding the very issues being discussed. The studio remained quiet, the audience sensing the gravity of the moment. This was no longer about academic credentials or celebrity activism. It had become a confrontation, about respect, about whether creative professionals deserve to be taken seriously when they step beyond entertainment. Throughout the exchange, Natalie's posture remained upright. Though visibly affected, she did not lash out. Instead, she appeared determined to defend not only her film, but the legitimacy of her profession and her right to speak as an informed citizen. Her response underscored the idea that artists, like anyone else, can hold informed opinions shaped by education, travel, and engagement. The segment, intended to promote a film about women's rights under authoritarian regimes, had evolved into a broader debate about elitism, class, and credibility. It revealed the fault lines that often emerge when discussions of art intersect with politics and identity. And as cameras continued to roll, it became clear that this was more than a fleeting disagreement. It was a moment that would likely spark conversation long after the show ended. The confrontation had escalated far beyond a tense exchange of opinions. It had transformed into something raw and chaotic, the kind of live television moment that no producer can fully control once emotions take over. What began as a discussion about art and politics had unraveled into accusations, raised voices, and personal insults that left the entire studio frozen in disbelief. When Natalie asserted that reducing her decades-long career to playing dress-up was disrespectful not only to her, but to every working actor who dedicates their life to the craft, she wasn't simply defending herself. She was defending an industry built on storytelling, discipline, and collaboration. Acting, as she implied, requires study, empathy, research, and relentless work. To trivialize it as costume and pretense was to ignore the depth and effort behind it. Joy's mocking laughter in response only sharpened the divide. She framed Natalie's reaction as oversensitivity, suggesting that someone who dishes out powerful themes in films should be able to endure criticism. But Natalie made a clear distinction. Honest criticism would address the film's themes, structure, or execution. What she was experiencing, she argued, were personal attacks meant to undermine her credibility rather than engage with her ideas. As the debate spiraled, Joy leaned harder into the class divide, questioning Natalie's privilege and asking when she had last struggled to pay rent or put food on the table. The studio fell into a heavy silence. The hum of cameras seemed louder, in the absence of audience reaction. Even crew members appeared visibly uncomfortable, aware that the conversation had crossed into deeply personal territory. Natalie's response was measured but firm. She acknowledged that her background did not erase her right to create art or speak on issues she cared about. Success, she suggested, should not be grounds for dismissal. If anything, it came with a responsibility to use influence thoughtfully. Her statement that attempts to silence her because of her achievements revealed more about her critic than about her felt like a turning point, one that visibly rattled Joy. Joy countered that she wasn't silencing anyone. She was merely asking whether Natalie recognized that she did not speak for everyone. Natalie agreed she didn't represent every viewpoint, but she insisted she had the right to express her own responsibly. That word, responsibly, ignited another outburst. Joy accused her of demonizing half the country, framing the film as an attack on traditional values. Natalie's reply was sharper now, her voice gaining strength. The film, she explained, depicted what happens when societies trade freedom for the illusion of security. It did not target individuals, it explored universal themes. And if someone saw themselves reflected negatively in the story, perhaps that warranted introspection rather than outrage. The audience gasped at the boldness of that statement. The exchange deteriorated rapidly after that. Joy accused Natalie of implying fascism. Natalie clarified she had named no one. Joy labeled her an elitist. Natalie pointed out the unprofessional tone, even challenging Joy for calling her sweetheart during a heated debate. The word lingered in the air like a slap, underscoring the power dynamics at play. As tempers flared, other hosts attempted unsuccessfully to intervene. The suggestion of a commercial break was brushed aside. What viewers were witnessing was no longer debate. It was meltdown. Joy's voice rose to a near scream while Natalie's responses grew colder, more deliberate, almost surgical in their precision. When Joy stood and declared it my show, Natalie's calm rebuttal that the program was called The View, not a personal hour, landed like a thunderclap. It highlighted the shift from shared dialogue to territorial defensiveness. Whoopi? Goldberg's attempt to restore order felt small against the tidal wave of emotion crashing across the table. Accusations of arrogance, elitism, propaganda, and insecurity flew back and forth. The audience's reaction blurred into uneasy murmurs and scattered applause. Sarah Haynes appeared visibly shaken. Sunny Hostin pleaded for calm. But the core, conflict had moved beyond moderation. Natalie eventually stood, her movements deliberate and controlled, signaling a decision to disengage. She accused Joy not of ideological disagreement, but of bullying and unprofessional conduct. Joy, in turn, claimed she was being attacked in her own house. Natalie's response, that a television studio demands professionalism, cut through the noise with chilling clarity. The conversation veered into questions of identity and patriotism when Joy invoked real Americans. Natalie's composed rebuttal, that disagreement does not negate belonging, underscored a broader message about inclusivity and national identity. Her reference to being born in Jerusalem yet living her entire life as an American citizen reframed the debate as one about values rather than labels. By the time Natalie turned directly to the camera, speaking about how people react when their ideas are challenged, the segment had fully transcended its original purpose. It was no longer about a film. It had become a live demonstration of the very themes under dispute: power, insecurity, discourse, and the fragility of public debate. Joy's anger peaked with accusations of arrogance and condescension. Natalie's final responses were calm but final. She removed her microphone, set it down, and stated that she had come to discuss her work in good faith. Instead, the conversation had devolved into spectacle. As she prepared to leave, the room felt suspended in time. The cameras were still, rolling. The audience was silent. The other hosts looked stunned, caught between professional obligation and personal discomfort. Natalie smoothed her dress, her expression composed despite the storm that had just unfolded. What remained was not just the memory of raised voices, but the stark illustration of how quickly dialogue can collapse when mutual respect disappears. The clash was less about politics and more about the boundaries of discourse, about whether disagreement can exist without dehumanization. In the end, the confrontation served as an unexpected case study in the dynamics of live media, how ego, ideology, and emotion can overtake intention. What had been planned as a thoughtful conversation about art became a televised lesson in the difficulty of sustaining civil debate in an age where every word carries amplified weight. The confrontation had reached a breaking point, and there was no disguising it anymore. Joy's frustration had boiled over into visible fury. Her voice was sharp, strained, almost trembling as she accused Natalie of trying to escape the conversation. From her perspective, this was still an interview, unfinished, unresolved, and spiraling out of her control. She insisted that walking away was unacceptable, that guests did not simply decide when a segment was over. But the situation had clearly evolved beyond the structure of a typical televised discussion. Natalie, composed despite the emotional intensity in the room, did not raise her voice in return. Instead, she stated plainly that what was happening no longer resembled an interview. In her view, it had devolved into something more chaotic, less about dialogue and more about unchecked anger. She framed her departure not as avoidance, but as a refusal to engage in what she perceived as a public tantrum. It was a calculated choice, one that signaled a boundary rather than surrender. Joy's voice cracked as she demanded that Natalie return to her seat. Accusations of cowardice followed, a last attempt to provoke a reaction or reassert dominance in a moment that was slipping through her fingers. The energy in the studio was volatile. Every camera remained fixed, capturing not just words but expressions, flushed faces, clenched jaws, wide-eyed hosts unsure whether to intervene or stay silent. Natalie paused at the edge of the set. That pause felt deliberate, almost cinematic. She turned back one final time, her expression steady. Her response was cutting but controlled. She suggested that the only heat present in the studio was the result of embarrassment over unprofessional behavior. It was not an attack delivered in anger, but a measured observation delivered with clarity. She made it clear that she would be open to conversation, real conversation, when it could occur with mutual respect and professionalism. Then she walked off the set. The act itself was quiet, but its impact thundered through the studio. Joy remained standing for a moment, visibly shaking with rage, as if stunned by the finality of it. The other hosts sat frozen, caught between shock and disbelief. No one immediately filled the silence. No witty remark, no attempt at humor, no commercial break announcement could immediately soften what had just unfolded. The audience, too, seemed unsure how to react. Some appeared on the verge of applause, others looked alarmed, perhaps wondering if security would need to step in. The tension in the air was thick and almost physical. Live television has a way of amplifying raw emotion, and this moment was no exception. It was unscripted, unfiltered, and impossible to rewind. Joy eventually lowered herself back into a chair, breathing heavily. The cameras continued to roll, documenting every second of the aftermath. The studio lights seemed brighter, harsher, as if illuminating the gravity of what had occurred. For several seconds, no one spoke. That silence was more powerful than any shouting match. It carried the weight of shock, of confusion, of collective processing. Producers behind the scenes were likely scrambling, deciding whether to cut to commercial, whether to issue a statement, whether to pivot to another topic. But for viewers at home, what they saw was a rare glimpse of television stripped of its usual polish. There were no rehearsed lines left. There was no easy resolution. Moments like this become cultural flashpoints precisely because they feel authentic. They reveal how quickly structured dialogue can unravel when emotions eclipse restraint. In that silence, audiences were left to form their own interpretations. Was Natalie justified in leaving? Did Joy push too far? Was this a clash of personalities, ideologies, or simply two strong-willed individuals unwilling to yield? The emotional residue lingered even after the segment ended. Social media would undoubtedly light up with divided opinions. Supporters on both sides would dissect every sentence, every gesture, every inflection. Analysts would debate professionalism, free speech, media responsibility, and the blurred line between confrontation and conversation. What made the moment unforgettable was not merely the shouting or the dramatic exit. It was the vulnerability of it, the way it exposed the fragility of live discourse. Daytime television, typically known for structured debate and moderated disagreement, had suddenly become a stage for something far more intense. As the silence stretched on, it felt almost symbolic. It reflected the larger cultural struggle over how to engage in disagreement without dehumanizing one another. It underscored how quickly conversations can collapse when ego and emotion override empathy and patience. By the time the cameras finally cut away, the moment had already secured its place in television history. Not because it was explosive in volume alone, but because it was undeniably human, flawed, messy, and emotionally charged.